So thank you everybody who's attending here at the Federal Academy for Security Policy in Pankow, and welcome everybody who is following us in the live stream. My name is Henrik Ritter. I'm very happy to have the International Institute for Strategic Studies as a first-time active participant in our German Forum on Security Policy, and I'm happy to give you the floor for this panel, and thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our research findings here. My name is Alex Bolfras. I'm the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the IISS office in Berlin. So good afternoon to all of you in the room here, and hello to all of you watching online in whichever time zone you happen to be in. The title of our panel today is The Transfer of Arms Technology and Dual-Use Goods to Rogue Actors. And I can't help but open with the observation that in the last few weeks, we've seen great strides in the trade of toys and auto parts and other things. But when it comes to the trade in arms and dual-use goods, it's unclear if we're in as good a shape there. So, of course, on this topic, we're seeing a lot of new actors, a lot of new technologies of concern. And there's an open question about whether the existing, I don't want to call them old, but existing national and multilateral regimes that are in place to control these kinds of items are up to the challenges of today's realities. Fortunately, we'll know a little bit more once this panel concludes, because we have three absolutely outstanding experts with us who happen to be wonderful colleagues of mine as well, who will be presenting on different angles of the subject and sharing their expertise with us. So I'll begin my introductions immediately to my right. Is Dr. Maria Shagina. She is the Diamond Brown Senior Fellow for Economic Sanctions, Standards, and Strategy. We also have Wolf Christian Piss next to me, who is the Senior Fellow for Armed Conflict. And last and never least is Fabian Hinz, who is a research fellow for defense and military analysis. We've flipped multiple coins and have decided that it makes the most sense for Maria to begin her presentation.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. I'd like to offer my insights first by looking at the multilateral export control regimes and the nature of export controls before diving into the Russian case on export controls. So the nature of export controls has been changing for a while. China's indigenization and Russia's war in Ukraine has really made the traditional controls either obsolete or ill-fitted to control the new technology. And I would say three key factors have shaped this, this development. First is the dysfunctional multilateral export control regimes. Second, the technological advancement. And third, the change in relationship between government and industries. So zooming in on each of these, if we highlight probably the most important multilateral export control regime, the Wassenaar arrangement that is in charge for controlling dual-use goods, has been created for a different era, and organizationally and conceptually is probably not the best regime now to really address all of the challenges, simply because it's meant to be geographically neutral, country agnostic. Can be less calibrated, and it's been developed in a different geopolitical environment where Russia is a veto power there. So any changes have been blocked then since 2022. But also conceptually, it's been mainly created for the non-proliferation, terrorism, other issues where mainly non-state actors and rogue states have been the principal threats. And now we have, again, Russia and China, who are much more deeply embedded in global supply chains, but also when it comes to China, they have much greater capabilities to localize technologies with various degrees of success, but this is a main difference. But we'll hear at our panel as well that the rogue states it was through the increasing cooperation with Russia and China, but also gaining ground and importance in this area. When it comes to technological advancements, they are developing faster than controls that are supposed to control this technology. And here in particular, emerging technology, emerging and disruptive technology is the case in point. And one shouldn't look further than the war in Ukraine, where just a couple of days ago, Ukrainian marine drone has destroyed a Russian fighter jet, and previously missile-guided ship, which has really upended the warfare as we know it, and really indicates how future warfare will develop. And also, just by statistical numbers, now drones inflict all 70% of casualties, both in Russia and Ukraine, and it's not the heavy artillery that is being supplied. And with dual-use goods, we're talking about increasing commercialization, and this is coming to the third point about this changing nature of government and industries, where it's the private sector that is in the driving seat when it comes to developing this technology. So they control the supply chains, should at least have a better understanding where this technology ends. And this is in stark contrast to Cold War times, where up to 70% of technology innovations were developed by government and not the private sector. For example, in the US, it's the private companies that are leading in 11 out of 14 critical technology areas identified by DoD, and this is the private sector, in particular in quantum, AI, and biotechnology, that is leading in R&D expenditure. So as a result, a new approach is needed and a new tool set is needed, and all of this has been tested both in Chinese and Russian cases. But the Russian case has been a testing ground, and particularly for assembling global coalitions. So the coalitions of the willing that are much more flexible, ad hoc, issue-based coalition that is now the new feature of expert control regimes, as we've seen. Either it's Russia-related, semiconductor-related. A lot of these coalitions have emerged since 2022. But the Russian case really exemplified what can be developed as the so-called Wassenaar -1 framework beyond the existing multilateral framework, was led by the US together with 38 allies and partners, and really centered around this foreign direct product rule, which is, if you want, the extraterritorial sanctions of export controls, where US technology is very broadly defined, whether it's design, spare components, or know-how cannot be shipped beyond borders because of the intellectual property. And in contrast to 2014, where we had export controls, but very small on very limited number of technologies. This time, countries in Asia, such as Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea joined, which was very crucial because Russia relied on them in terms of CNC machines, or Taiwan has really been this outsourcing. TSMC was actually in charge of many for the production of semiconductors that Russia claimed to localize domestically. So where we are in terms of effectiveness of export controls on Russia, the picture is rather mixed, as you can guess, and that is really going into the nature of export controls, the limitations of what they can do. So Russian defense sector, as you probably heard, is booming at the expense of civilian economy. Since the start of the war, around 200 companies specializing in production of drones have been established. Yes, Russia is paying more for the chips. Some estimates suggested it's 6 times more. But also it's of subpar quality, yet it doesn't stop the Russian war machine to go further, which is again probably the key lesson for export controls, that just because it's lower end quality, subpar quality, doesn't mean it's unimportant for the targets or those who want to continue the war. In 2014, Russia still imported 700 million euros of the battlefield items per month, slight decrease from 2023, where there was 1 billion. So Russia continues finding ways to circumvent that. And here the silver lining is that its import substitution has failed and localization has failed, so it still relies on Western technologies. The example here is the Shahed drones that have now been produced in Russia. For example, in 2023, the comparison between 2023 and 25 shows that actually the number of phone and components increased by almost 2 times. The US and Switzerland have 40% and 15% shares in the composition of these drones. China has increased the shipping of components by 3 times. Important to distinguish that they're not necessarily Chinese original components, but China is the main transshipment hub here. And those components that been manufactured in 2022, 24, so when the export controls have been put in place. China has been, again, the key supplier of dual-use technologies. Publicly, they deny the supply of any lethal weapons, but the supply of dual-use goods still not unimportant, as you can see, because it can be so applied in such a versatile way. And again, it underlines the different nature of warfare, that it's not unimportant. What Beijing has done is basically exploited the notion of export control, of the notion of dual-use goods, really supplying goods that, well, sometimes it's battle, the bulletproof vessels or armed vehicles. So it's really exploiting what can be considered as dual-use goods. It's a main transshipment hub. Up to 80% of Western components, chips, are being redirected via China and Hong Kong in particular. And there's been also a growing source for CNC machines that are used to produce other components. So it's a systematic effort. And one other element, a weakness of Western export control regimes is Western subsidiaries, either in third countries or in China. For example, the recent example that Japanese CNC machines were exported to Russia via subsidiary in China. Having said that, the backfill option of China when it supplies its original technology is growing, but it's still small. So again, it's still the Western components that end up in Russian war machine rather than the original Chinese ones. In 2024, China supplied battlefield goods to Russia worth $4.6 billion, which is a substantial number to continue the war, and important if it's a war of attrition. And that highlights 3 points, and I'll stop there, of the effectiveness of export controls. First of all, the understanding that the efficacy of export controls is time-bound, that there is only a certain period of time where the effectiveness is actually working, because the target is still trying to adapt, and we see it statistically that as soon as the export controls are put in place, we see a dip in terms of the exports and the rerouting circumvention tactics, and then Russia adapts and it goes against the spikes again. So the need to constantly update export controls is really necessary, something that the US has done much more quicker vis-a-vis China than vis-a-vis Russia. Second one is that the enforcement has been lagging, and that it depends on various factors, but one of them is the deeper involvement of small and middle-sized enterprises who are much more ill-equipped to understand due diligence, who haven't been investing too much into this and now have to deal with it. So governments globally, and particularly BIS in the US and the UK, have invested a lot in business outreach to create this tailored guidance to smaller businesses to understand how to control this technology, but also to rely on actors who've been much more traditional in this, and this is financial institutions. We have a number of guidances, so-called Tri-Seal Note, that specifically call on financial institutions to monitor export control violations. That is not to say that they are super happy about this or well equipped to do so, but that is one way to go about this as well. And finally, the understanding that The effectiveness of Russian export controls depends on the effectiveness of Iranian export controls, North Korean, because they collaborate much more actively. So any export control around this axis of upheaval needs to be either leveled off or updated much more frequently than was done before. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Fabian, please.
Well, thank you so much. I will briefly introduce myself. I'm Fabian Hinz, Research Fellow for Defense and Military Analysis, and I mostly focus on the proliferation of UAVs and missiles. And I would really like to talk a little about how the spread of technology among disruptive actors and cooperation between disruptive actors is changing the wider strategic picture. And to begin with, I would like to use the case study of the Houthis. You probably all saw the reports yesterday about a Houthi missile hitting Tel Aviv airport and flights being canceled, so quite a current topic. And when you look at the Houthis, you can kind of trace the evolution of these transfers quite well. As you will probably remember, the Houthis took over huge parts of northern Yemen in 2015. And initially, they were seen as an Iranian-supported group, but basically a group that only has minor support. So people thought about opportunistic support from the side of Iran, a bit of financial support, a bit of arms, but nothing too dramatic. Now, when the Houthis took over, they also took over the missile capabilities of the old Yemeni army that stayed loyal to the old Yemeni president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who cooperated with the Houthis. So they had a very minor capability of Chinese anti-ship missiles, North Korean-built Scud missiles, Soviet-made missiles, which they put to use. And pretty quickly, we saw new capabilities being added. Iran at first tried to maintain a veneer of deniability, so systems were delivered that were quite close to what the Yemenis already had, but modified with longer ranges. And then we saw this support being continuously expanded and expanded. So you had ballistic missiles with ever greater ranges until the point where they could hit Riyadh, where they could hit Dubai in the war against the Saudi-led coalition, which began in 2015. Then we saw long-range one-way attack UAVs, or suicide drones, as they're sometimes called, anti-ship missiles, which were also used before the current conflict, but on a much more limited scale, unmanned surface vessels, so explosive drone boats, and a number of other capabilities. Now, with the Houthis, if you were a military analyst interested in Iranian missiles, this was all tremendously interesting, but basically the larger world did not care that much, seeing it mostly as a regional problem, and seeing the arsenal as mostly limited and only for use against the neighboring states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that supported the intervention. Now, in 2022, we had the ceasefire, and the Houthis started staging a few parades, and they started parading ever more capable systems. So a huge diversity of anti-ship missiles, precision-guided ballistic missiles, et cetera, et cetera. Now, fast forward to October 7th, 2023. We all know what happened, and we all know that the Houthis began basically their attempt to enforce a naval blockade against Israel, started hitting Israel proper. And they did succeed in halting a huge amount of the ship traffic through the Bab el-Mandab and the Red Sea. Of course, the global economy has adapted, but still they managed to disrupt these global trade flows quite a bit. The Western military intervention that started in 2024 and that is still ongoing and actually seeing increased activity from the American side did not really manage to halt these attacks either. At the same time, the Houthis are still using the missiles in a different way, deterring Saudi Arabia and the UAE from potentially restarting a war. This is something these countries are not really keen on. And the threat of Houthi missile attacks against Riyadh or Dubai serves further to deter any potential action. Now, what is really interesting with these capabilities in the Houthis is if you do a little thought experiment and think about how the Houthis would look like if it was 1992, what could the Houthis actually do? They probably would have artillery systems, so they could bomb targets within Saudi Arabia, let's say 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 if they have long-range systems. They would have speedboats, so they could attack commercial shipping, but it's quite easy to defend against a speedboat. We saw that with Somali pirates. That's something that even private security companies can deter in many cases. And striking Israel, perhaps they would be able to do a terrorist attack somewhere abroad, but that's basically it. So what you're seeing with the Houthis is that these new technologies being delivered to disruptive actors do not only equip these actors with tools that they can use for their existing strategies, but basically enable them to come up with entirely new strategies that would not be possible without these technologies. So one framework you can think about with the Houthis is that they're engaged in a form of standoff guerrilla warfare, What they're doing will not defeat the US military. It will not defeat the Israeli military for sure, but they can inflict costs. They will not go away. They're incredibly difficult to deter. And all military action, even if it's done by the most capable global military power, is not really able to stop these kind of actions. So the big question here, of course, is this a really exceptional case that has been enabled by Iran's willingness to transfer really capable systems? You won't find a lot of countries around the world willing to transfer intermediate range ballistic missiles to non-state actors. Or is this something that we will have to get used to, that non-state actors will have the ability to project power over long distances and can, for example, threaten commercial ship traffic in one of the world's busiest shipping lanes? I think the answer is probably a bit of both. With these really capable systems, it is exceptional for Iran to transfer them. But on the lower scale of the technological level, we will probably see more of it. And my colleague Wolf Christian Pass will perhaps elaborate on that a little. The second case study I want to look at a little bit closer is the Russian-Iranian cooperation. So Russia and Iran have always cooperated to some extent. We had surface-to-air missile systems, Russian design, Soviet design being delivered to Iran, like the S-300. We had single Russian individuals helping the Iranian ballistic missile program in the 1990s. But what we've seen after the start of the war against Ukraine has been a new dimension, and most importantly, a reversal of the one-sided flow of technology, which before had been exclusively from Russia to Iran. We saw Iran not only exporting their Shahed 136 drones, but also ammunition, and then enabling local license production. And then we had reports about Iran also delivering a large number of ballistic missiles. Here, it is a bit unclear how far the deal has proceeded. So apparently there were some hiccups. Now there are some indications it might be going ahead, with launches finally being delivered, but it's a bit uncertain. And we, of course, saw that the Iranians were not only willing to transfer systems, but transfer technology and enable the large-scale production of these Shahed drones inside Russia. According to Ukrainian sources, last year we had about 6,000 Shaheds being produced inside Russia. There might be plans to produce as many as 25,000 this year. They're basically used every day in the war in Ukraine. And what is interesting here is a number of things. First, the question, how will the technology flow from Russia to Iran evolve? There's lots of speculation about Russia helping Iran with capabilities like cyber, espionage, domestic surveillance technology, potentially submarine technology, ballistic missile technology, space launch technology. Iran really wants to strengthen its domestic arms industry, and every transfer of technology from the Russian side would be really useful for that. Then, of course, the transfer of highly capable systems like fighter jets, Su-35. But again, we haven't seen much in the open, so it's still a bit of a question what exactly will be delivered. Now, in the larger strategic picture, what is really interesting here, and one can draw the parallels with North Korea, is that these countries really complement each other in the military production. So you have Russia producing very advanced ballistic missile systems, very advanced fighter jets, but you have countries like Iran, North Korea that just produce affordable mass and are willing to put this affordable mass at the disposal of Russia's war of aggression. And then, of course, you can also see that the center of military innovation is shifting to some extent. With the Shahed drones, they are technologically not that complicated. A lot of countries could have built these, but it was the Iranian innovation to basically build a very, very simple cruise missile system, and that's the way they would work. And the Russians had no comparable system in service, so they not only imported a weapon system, the way they import artillery systems, but they imported a whole new concept that they did not have as part of their doctrine before and made it a center part of their standoff warfare and have really doubled down on it with expansion of production facilities. So I would say that this is not only showing a new extent of cooperation between these countries, but also a new global dispersal of military innovation, which of course we're also seeing in other places that are much less problematic. If you think of Turkey or South Korea, which were not traditional large military producers, but are now producing quite exceptional systems in many areas. Finally, it is probably important to think about the limits of this cooperation. When we're looking at it from the outside, we often have this fear of a new alliance of rogues forming. If you look at it from an Iranian perspective, and the Iranians are very, very open about their cooperation with Russia and the Soviet Union, at least the one in the past, the current one is a little bit more murky. You see there's a huge amount of distrust and a long history of distrust. These are both regimes that are not very pleasant to their own populace, to the wider global community. And I think it's difficult for them to suddenly switch around and engage in the kind of high trust relationship that you need for a proper alliance. So the Iranians have this list of grievances of how the Russians treated them, how the Russians did not take them seriously, tried to exploit basically them having no other source for military technology to demand outrageous prices. They have this history of Russia using them as leverage in their own negotiations and conflict with the West, basically delaying deliveries of systems in order to gain leverage when negotiating with the West. I think all of that will affect the future trajectories. So while there certainly is a lot of pragmatic cooperation, it currently at least seems perhaps not unlikely, but difficult for a full alliance in the Western sense of the word that would include high levels of trust to emerge. And that's it from my side. Passing over to Wolf Christian.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, the challenge is obviously that my colleagues have already covered a lot of ground, so I'll try to just complement it here and there a little bit before we open it up to discussion. By way of background, I should say, I've been working for many, many years on the Houthis in Yemen. So a lot of my examples will come from that conflict theater. I was a member of the panel of experts monitoring the arms transfers until 2023 when I came over to IISS. So I had the privilege to actually disassemble a couple of Houthi weapon systems, mostly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And that really got me interested in the inner workings, in particularly of UAVs and missiles. Since our topic here is partially dual-use technology, I think it makes sense to step back for a second and just remember what we're really talking about. I mean, dual-use technology obviously is a much broader field than technology, which is what we've mostly been talking about. And it's also nothing new, right? So there's this tendency in policy circles to say, oh, if you talk about dual-use technology, you're talking about nuclear, or you're talking about electronics, AI, I mean, it's seen as a bit of a nerdy subject by a lot of people. And I feel when I talk to policymakers in different countries, very often you can see sort of how they mentally shut off, after when you start talking about these things and saying, oh, this is boring stuff for the experts. I don't have to deal with that. We have capable experts somewhere. It's important to remember dual-use technology is nothing new, right? So, I mean, if you go back to World War I time, when, for example, ammonium compounds were discovered to have both a military use and a use as a fertilizer, I mean, that was already a dual-use technology, and dual-use technology has been around, therefore, for a very long time, as have been efforts to control them. However, indeed, what we're seeing, and I think both Maria and Fabian have been hinted at that, is particularly in the last 20 years, there has been a bit of a revolution of military affairs, which we here in Europe for a while didn't quite see. And I would say that only changed with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and then the use of both first-person view drones, these little quadcopters where you drop small munitions on the battlefield, or which you use for reconnaissance, and then in particular with weapons like the Shahed, where you deliver munitions over hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers. And that's only when people noticed that clearly something was changing. But of course, it didn't begin there. I mean, when I started working in Yemen in 2018, the Houthis were already quite busy using very similar systems, in particular, actually, not so much Shahed. They used a different model, the Samad, for a similar use. We're not quite sure why, as a matter of fact, but it's the same technology. So basically, you have a relatively cheaply indigenous product based, of course, on Iranian concepts and designs, using commercially available technology to deliver ammunition over a fairly long range. And 2018, we were talking about, say, 150, 200 kilometers, which was already fairly impressive. So, I mean, way beyond the horizon capability, basically. But of course, by now we're talking about ranges of 2,000, even 2,400 kilometers for the same kind of weapon systems. Whereas the amount of explosives you can carry is relatively small, right? Because obviously, the longer the distance, the smaller the payload usually. It's still something that I think 20 years ago would have been totally inconceivable, that you basically have a armed group, a non-state armed group, a rebel force sitting in the mountains of a impoverished nation, being able to threaten a country like Israel or the US Navy. And that's what we're facing at the moment. So I think the really interesting thing is not so much that dual use technology is around, because it always has been, but how it has really enabled this revolution that we are a bit late in realizing. So 2018, I remember after my first couple of visits to the Gulf, I actually had a meeting at the Ministry of Defense here in Berlin, and being the good German I am, I did go to the colleagues at the relevant desk and said, so by the way, what if a weapon like this would be in the hand of a terrorist group closer to us? What would we do? I mean, what would our defense be? And quite honestly, I didn't think they took me terribly seriously. And they said things along the lines of, oh, you know, Yemen is really very far. What do we have to do with that? All of which is true, right? I mean, Yemen is not exactly in the core of German strategic interest. But what I try to explain to them, myself and colleagues, of course, is that technology tends to proliferate, right? And I mean, we've seen this with other weapons in the past. We've seen it with IEDs, which made an appearance in the early 1990s in Iraq, improvised explosive devices. Some of us will recall how they suddenly made an impact on the battlefield, and which are now just about everywhere, right? And the same will undoubtedly happen, certainly with the lower end of the technology spectrum. Maybe not ballistic missiles being able to fly over 2,000 kilometers, but certainly suicide UAVs flying over a range of several hundred, if not 1,000 kilometers. And that's really something that is, I would say, in the next 10 years. So first point is we're obviously a bit slow on the uptake, we as the European governments in realizing these new threats. Now, by now, everyone is fully aware of it, but I would say it really took until February 2022 and thereafter for people to wake up. And at the time, the threat had already been around for at least 10 years, I would say. So, you know, we tend to be running after the fact that Maria already mentioned that, right? I mean, export controls in particular are very slow in responding. So now, what kind of proliferation risk are we talking about? So far, we see the proliferation of UAV technology to states primarily and to non-state armed groups as part of the so-called axis of resistance, right? I mean, we've tracked similar systems with groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, name it, the Houthis, various Iraqi groups over the years. What we've not seen so far is a movement towards criminal or terrorist group outside of those actors. But that's undoubtedly going to be the next step, because the technology itself is relatively simple, right? And it will happen. And that's when it will potentially get really hairy, because, I mean, as most of you do know, for a military actor, the main threat dealing with a Samad or Shahid type of weapon is that it's fairly difficult and expensive to defend against them, right? Because, I mean, our air defense systems are geared towards more sophisticated weapons. And I mean, I do remember that the Saudis in the beginning were using, for example, Patriot interceptors to shoot down UAVs. You know, one Patriot interceptor is $1 million. Samad type UAV is possibly $10,000, 10 to 15,000. There's still a bit of a debate. So it's a numbers game, right? Even for countries like the Saudi Arabia, it's very hard to sustain this. Later on, then they started using MRAMs and to shoot them down from fighter planes. You may have seen the videos. The Royal Saudi Air Force was always very happy when they shot down a Shahid or Samad UAV, without considering that an MRAM then is what, $200,000, and you know the UAV is still 10,000. So it's something you cannot win purely from, you know, how many interceptors do you have for the kind of threat you face, because the other side can produce them more cheaply and more quickly than we can resupply. But the real challenge is soft targets, right? So a hardened military target, you know, will survive probably an impact by 30 kilograms of TNT equivalent, but not a commercial ship. And that's why we have the discussion, for example, in the Red Sea that Fabian has already alluded to, particularly not one that transports flammable substances. but also think about what would happen if you detonate the payload on a busy tourist beach, for example, say in Egypt or Greece or something like that. And that's what these weapons are really designed for, right? I mean, they're not designed to hit military targets. They usually carry fragmentation. As you know, fragmentation is there to kill people. It's not to destroy a hardened target. And they're designed to explode over the target. So I've seen images, I think 2018 it was, when the Houthis detonated a Qasef UAV, so a shorter range UAV, over a military parade, actually over the stand where the general staff was standing, because, you know, the new recruits were marching by, and, you know, the general staff of the Yemeni army was standing there, and they detonated it over the stand. And yeah, half of the general staff was severely wounded in the attack. Now imagine this was a beach, or, you know, an expo ground or something like that, basically a civilian target. So it's hard to imagine what would that look like. And so we've been lucky in a sense that this technology has not made it quite to people who are willing to carry out those attacks. But I dare say it's only a matter of time until that happens. So what components are we talking about? What type of dual use goods are we talking about? Again, both Maria and Fabian have already mentioned a few. There's obviously engines of different types, right? I mean, that's one area where there's still a lot of sort of technology coming from other countries. Very often the original products are actually from Europe, even today. I mean, there's a fair bit of import substitution. But Chinese and Iranian manufacturers are trying to basically replicate technology designs from others. But I mean, they're still, there were Czech jet engines, there were Dutch jet engines recently, there have been German UAV engines in fairly large quantities, as a matter of fact. They're servo actuators, so basically servo motors often used to move the control surfaces of both drones and missiles. They're obviously electronics. Again, we've heard about it. There's any number of sensors, antenna systems, optics, and so on and so on. And the real challenge, again, Maria mentioned this already, is that the export control regimes are really not keeping track of the technology innovation. So it's not so much that the control regimes themselves are poor. The problem is that the control lists are really not up to date. So, I mean, when I remember a couple of years ago, I think 2021, we published 3 or 4 pages of, you know, non-Iranian components found in Houthi missile systems, because we figured you can't really easily stop Iran anyway, but you might at least stop the others from providing them. Out of that, maybe a third was Chinese, the rest was European, North American, or various other Asian states. Not a single of those items was on the Wassenaar list, not one, right? And I have not checked today, but I dare say that probably hasn't changed massively. And the problem is most countries' export control regimes are basically copies of the Wassenaar arrangement list, right? Even countries who are not part of Wassenaar, for example, a lot of Asian countries, but also countries like Oman, for example, their export control legislation tends to be a copy and paste, which makes both investigations, but also stopping flows really, really challenging. And well, I mean, that brings me to my final point, and maybe that is a good opener for the discussion. What can we do about it? Again, I think there's a couple of points that really stand out. I mean, one is that we need to be more aware of technology developments. So the same way we somehow didn't see the threat coming, sort of both the FPV, but also the long-range suicide drones. I'm sure there's going to be new technology trends in the future, and we just need to be more aware about these things so we're not surprised, we as policymakers here in Europe or elsewhere. We're really, you know, I think we're sometimes lacking the imagination, right? Because, I mean, again, you know, 20 years ago, nobody saw this coming. 5 years ago or 6 years ago, a lot of people in the German Air Force and the US Air Force and the UK Air Force would have argued, oh, this is not really a threat. And now we're seeing that technology like this is really the great equalizer on the battlefield, right? So it allows groups like the Houthis, but also other non-state armed groups to basically substitute for an air force, right? That's the way they're using them, basically in functions where other countries would use planes. But it also allows them to shoot down expensive kit at relatively low cost, right? You may have heard, if you're following the news, that the US lost a couple of Reaper UAVs over Yemen. The number is quite a bit of a matter of concern. So, I mean, the Houthis claim 22 kills. That seems to be wildly out of league. So probably it was a few more, but they certainly have managed to shoot down a couple of Reapers. Reapers are also weapon systems that easily cost, what, $15 million, give or take, depending on exactly the composition. If you manage to shoot one of them down with a weapon system that maybe costs 20 or 30,000, and that's what we think they're doing. That's a really good cost-benefit ratio. So that's the one thing. We really need to be more aware and maybe less conservative in our estimates about what is possible. The other thing is, when it comes to dual-use technology, you tend to find two different schools of thoughts among policymakers. So there's the school of thought, the genie is out of the bottle anyway. We don't really need to do anything about it. Whatever will happen, and we don't really need to act, right? A surprisingly common perspective. And then there is sort of the other perspective, where technology is so advanced anyway, we don't really have to worry about it. And both of it is, of course, foolish, right? We're increasingly learning that we're not as technologically advanced as potential enemies. And whereas the genie is indeed out of the bottle, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to catch it. And as with any other kind of sort of sanctions-like instruments, the idea with export control is less that we're able to block each and every piece of technology from going to rogue actors. It's just about making it harder for them to do that. So basically the pressure, and again, Maria has mentioned that already, how Russia is paying 6 times as much as other states. That's exactly the effect that export controls and similar measures can have. So I think we need to pay more attention to export controls, not because we think we can stop the proliferation of technology, that is probably indeed too late, but we can make it harder for the other side, or the other sides, as it were, to obtain the technology. So we need to have a realistic approach to these things, rather than saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it, or it's not a risk. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to Alex.
Well, thank you all for those really informative and at times worrisome presentations. I'd like to open up the conversation to include those of you in the room here. I'll gather maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time. So if you could start to think about something you'd like to ask the panelists and identify yourself as you ask the question. I'd just like to put something on the table for all panelists to consider. And that is to, I'll be curious if there's anything that was said by some of the other presenters that produced a thought, a reaction in your mind that maybe there's some lessons that are transferable from one topic to the other. And then I'd maybe abuse my privilege a little bit here and ask the other 2 panelists to talk a little bit about what Christian had already talked about, and that is the question of what is to be done. And I think it'd be really interesting to focus in particular on the toolkits that are available to European defense and foreign ministries on your topic in particular. Okay, enough from me. Let's hear from you. If you'd like to signal using your hand or any other kind of device that you have a question, then I will call on you. There's no cause for shyness whatsoever. I can attest these are all very nice people. Yes, please.
Yes, hi, I'm a colleague from the IISS, and I have one question. So you talked a lot about Iranian support to the Houthis. And so if we look at Iranian support to regional non-state armed groups, what would be a difference between, for example, the Houthis and Hezbollah? Maybe to Fabian. Thank you.
If you still need time to formulate your questions, I'll just turn to the panel in the order of presentations.
Yes. So first on Hezbollah, it's quite interesting when you look at the arsenals before October 7th, that basically Hezbollah was the group that had the most capable arsenal, or was widely assumed to have the most capable arsenal, and definitely had the largest number of systems. And of course, they had this very favorable geography in terms of being able to hit Israel using really cheap short-range systems. So Hezbollah was always seen as this forward deterrent of Iran, with the idea being that if Iran gets attacked by Israel, if the Iranian nuclear program gets attacked, Iran not only itself would strike back using its ballistic missile force, but you would basically have these forward deterrent capabilities of Hezbollah that would be used. So I once spoke to an Israeli, and he basically compared it to the North Korean artillery that is pointed at Seoul, that deterred an attack on North Korea's nuclear program, that Hezbollah was basically fulfilling the same function. In the end, that threat didn't really materialize, and I think the big difference was between the Houthi situation and the Hezbollah situation was first, that Israel had tremendous intelligence on the Hezbollah. If you look at just the number of leaders killed and the number of strategic weapons it destroyed, it means they really had exceptional capabilities to track targets in real time. If you look at some of the US airstrikes right now, there are some indications that they're running out of targets and they're moving lower down the confidence ladder. So you're seeing an increase in civilian casualties. You see an increase in drones being shot down. Is that because the Houthis are getting better, or because the Americans are getting more aggressive when using them? So they just don't have the same intelligence on Yemen. And of course, Yemen is also a very hard country to penetrate for intelligence services compared to Lebanon. The other thing I would say that is different between the two is that Hezbollah got a little bit too conventional. They really want to destroy Israeli military capabilities. The Houthi way of war is still more guerrilla style. As long as they don't lose, they're kind of winning. It's more on the political, psychological level. If they don't hit an airbase and destroy F-35s, it's totally fine. Their whole strategy still survives. If they can hit an empty spot at Tel Aviv airport, it's already a huge win. So I think that is really the big difference between these two sides, probably because the Houthis had less capabilities and got a little less complacent, where Hezbollah at one point thought of itself, as the Iranians to some extent, is more of a conventional army, and then they had more conventional tactics that just didn't work out against Israel.
On a question, what has inspired us from other presentation, I would like to amplify what Fabian said in terms of the reverse relationship when it comes to Russia and the number of rogue states plus China. So prior to the war, it was the reverse relationship where Russia was supplying more or less advanced technology, more advanced was the time, to China, Iran, and North Korea, or maybe not North Korea, but was old Soviet technology. But now it finds itself on the receiving end. And it is indeed true that they might not form the alliance the way we understand it, the Western alliance, but it's still an agile, transactional partnership that comes at the right time with the right tools, with the right products that is needed for the warfare for both sides. And it's very much like we don't want to compare it necessarily with the US administration. It's a very asymmetrical statecraft. They get things for different needs, and it's not necessarily all defense linked, as Wolf Christian also alluded. Russia can help Iran or even China in other domains, cyber and other technologies that it still has. But the question here I think I have is, because Russia is on the receiving end and it has only limited pool of competitive advantages, how much longer can it give out the sort of disadvantages in military technology? How much longer can it trade them for, let's say, participation of North Korean troops in the war, or transferring submarine technology and so on? So there is a question that how long can it go on? And it is an issue of trust. None of them trust each other, but again, it's not important here. And one interesting fact from open source center that recently investigated North Korean supplies of ammunition to Russia in 2024, half of the North Korean ammunition was supplied and was used on the battlefield in Ukraine. So it's a massive, huge number of ammunition shells that has been used from an actor that really didn't have much economic relationship with Russia. It was mainly 90% was supported by China. Now we're seeing very different relationship around this axis of upheaval. On the second question, in terms of what can be done, I think I mentioned a couple of solutions during my presentation, but here it's both the design part is important and the enforcement part. The design, indeed, the lists are outdated. Some of it is due to the veto being placed now by Russia, but also because, again, the technology develops, so it's just old lists that are not coping up fast enough with the development of technological progress there. On the enforcement side, this is something, again, with the war in Ukraine became as a revelation that we need to implement what we announced. And now there is a race how to make sure that whatever is on the list is actually enforced properly. And here with the emerging technology, there is a different problem that we didn't see before. Because emerging technology is still emerging, we don't have the clear choke points that we have maybe with other technologies that are much more established within global supply chains. So it's much more dispersed. The US doesn't control it as they used to control in Cold War era times. So it relies, like we've seen with semiconductors, it relies on Japan, Netherlands, and other actors, Germany as well, that's contributing the key technology to production of this semiconductors. It relies on a plethora of actors. So again, the coalition of the willing is the key feature of this plurilateral export control frameworks. And also, again, the role of companies, that they are now in the driving seat and they need to understand where it's been used, the end user, which is much more complicated if it involves a number of shell companies, a number of intermediaries. So it's up to the companies really to understand. The problem is, as we've seen with the US testimony in the US Congress of key semiconductor companies, that they didn't really do this due diligence. They outsource it to distributors. So it's, again, a question of enforcement from also the private sector, how seriously they take and how comprehensive approach they take to due diligence.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, three quick points. One is geographic, right? We've already spoken a fair bit about sort of Iran, Russia, and North Korea, the Houthis, but I mean, that is still basically 3-4 centers of gravity. I think what we tend not to see, and I mean, that's my earlier point about sort of limited awareness, is that this technology is already spreading, not quite to proper terrorist groups, like I said, not to the Al-Qaedas or ISISs of this world, even though this is a matter of time. But, you know, we all heard about, I guess, the missile attack yesterday on Ben Gurion Airport close to Tel Aviv. What you may not have heard about is the UAV attack on Port Sudan airport today, right? So, I mean, in conflicts like that, like in Sudan and also in Ethiopia and the Tigray conflict a couple of years ago, both governments and non-government actors have already been applying the exact same technology, very often coming from Iran, but also coming from China, in some cases from other places. Turkey, in particular, is a very sort of as a proliferation hotspot, if I may say so, for sort of advanced, longer-range UAVs. So that's already the next geographic step, right? So, I mean, in that sense, the genie is truly out of the bottle. It's not Iran, North Korea, Russia that are around, but it's really groups what may way beyond that. And we're probably going to see more of that. And increasingly, we have the supply of weapons like this as a geostrategic tool, right? So, I mean, in Sudan, for example, is trying, actually both sides of the Sudan government, of the Sudan conflict, the Sudan armed forces, but also the ISF, have been buying technology on the market, and the governments supplying these technologies have been using this as an attempt to gain influence, right? And of course, they do this because actors like that have no easy access to these technology. They can't go and buy in the US or in Europe. So they look for a willing seller. And these transactions take place for money, but also for political influence, right? So, I mean, there's discussions, as you may or may not be aware, about Russian bases in Sudan, for example. That's all part of a greater bargain for influence. First point. Second point is, what kind of technology are we really talking about? I mean, some of this stuff is incredibly cheap and incredibly easy to source, right? So for the UAV technology, and I'm not talking about first-person view drones, I'm really talking about the ones that deliver a payload over 1,000 kilometers. Most of the technology comes from the radio-controlled hobby flying field, right? So, I mean, those people, enthusiasts who fly model aircraft here in Berlin or somewhere else. My son does this sort of stuff, right? So I spend a lot of time, he's 12, sitting at makeshift airfields, and I can tell you that the controls he uses to fly his little plane, which has an effective range of 3 kilometers or something like that, are literally the same the Houthis use. They tend to go for the high-end model, but I mean, it's stuff like that, right? So controllers with a value of $300. These engines that were powering earlier versions of Samat retail for about 1,500 euro. It's a German manufacturer, 3W in Bad Homburg. So this stuff is, of course, relatively difficult to control just because it's a mass production item in a sense. And the military applications are real, but they're very often not even known to the manufacturer until such time as their part suddenly shows up in a weapon system. And at that time, indeed, the genie is out of the bottle. And then finally, I think we really have a challenge in Europe when it comes to enforcement in terms of when do we sense these trends, right? Because, I mean, usually European export control professionals or even law enforcement professionals don't have access to the wreckage of these weapon systems in places like Iran or in Yemen because they're active war zones, because they're not seen as being sort of in the center of our strategic interest. But I mean, that's where you can actually sense the changes in technology, right? You can see that a UAV is suddenly powered by a different type of engine than before. But in order to know this, you actually need to be physically there or have easy access to this information. The more remote the battlefield, Ukraine is a bit of a special case. But I mean, that's why I deliberately spoke about places like Yemen or Sudan or Somalia. There is very little penetration, let's say, by European export control and law enforcement professionals. So we really have a bit of a blind spot, and that's why I'm afraid that, you know, for whatever is the next the wave of innovation, we might again be late in catching on to it. And maybe my final point, even if we do know about it, even if the company knows, most of the companies are not interested in this proliferation, right? So I mean, there's somehow this idea that economic actors make a lot of money of this. That tends to be not the case, at least not for the technology I mostly deal with. It's, you know, they have a large commercial business and they're always very concerned for reputational reasons that they hear their parts make it into weapon systems. But again, our system doesn't really know how to respond. And I can illustrate this with maybe one example. So there is a flow meter that is used in Iranian land attack cruise missiles in the so-called 351 family, what the Houthis call the Quds. It's the most effective, I would say, cruise missile design. Has been around since at least 2018-19. It's obviously Iranian, even though the Houthis claim it's one of theirs. And literally all of them have a German part. And the German part is the size. It's a flow meter made by a company called BD Sensors, somewhere in southern Germany. And the nice thing about the flow meter is it has a serial number. So if you, and because it basically tracks, it monitors the flow of the fuel to the engine, right? So it's towards the end of the missile, which means it usually survives the impact, right? So you find it often in the debris. And if you've seen a few of them, you can sort of track changes in supply patterns. And we were able to document how it ended up in Iran. So earlier specimens were exported via a company in Turkey, or even directly to Iran. And then later on, became more convoluted, and a lot of it went via China, which is basically the trend. Again, Maria mentioned that already. China is not just an important manufacturer, but also a transit point for Western equipment. Now, I got a phone call in October 2023, and that time point is important, by that company, and they said, "Oh, are you still interested in that flow meter?" And I said, "Yes, of course." And they said, "Oh, we have this uptick of orders from some of those companies which you had, you and your colleague, which the UN panel of experts had alerted us to as being potentially problematic. Should we be concerned?" And I said, "Yes, given the time point, like I said, this was October 2023, I think you might want to be concerned, but you're calling the wrong person here. I mean, I'm sure there are various German government departments who would love to have this information. Don't call me, call them." And I was able to provide a telephone number. I do hope they called them. But it shows that even companies who are aware and willing to do something about it don't find it very easy to find a telephone number or a contact within our system to pass on pertinent information like that, which to me implies that maybe somebody was trying to ramp up production if you're buying large quantities. And this is a $60 item. So again, it's nothing terribly sophisticated, and to this day, not a controlled item at all.
Thank you all for those answers. If there are any more questions, I would be glad to take them, and maybe to encourage a few others, if you don't want to be revealing the organization you work for on an internet live stream, feel free to ask in your private capacity without identifying where you're coming from. But please.
Hi, my name's Yvette Jacob. I work for the British Embassy here in Berlin. I'm responsible for sanctions, and I hear the challenge about enforcement. I wondered what would be your vision for a government industry dialogue partnership that can actually effectively address the concerns that you've set out. There's a lot of initiatives, a lot of gatherings of industry, lots of partners are trying to work on this together, but what is the thing that can help to keep up with enforcement?
Great question, thank you. Are there any others for this round? Yes, please.
I have a question for both Wolf, Christian, and Maria. So Wolf, you mentioned the replication of technologies by Dutch, Czech, and German organizations. What can they do to try and prevent that better, if possible? And then for Maria, what are then good practices for small and medium enterprises on learning from the bigger companies? Thank you.
Is anyone ready to go? Well, Christian, go ahead.
I should have said, let Maria start. No, I'm happy to go first. It's just maybe starting with Anmik's question about what companies can do, and to some extent that obviously also addresses the question from the UK. I think what was really interesting about the Dutch case, this was AMT, a manufacturer of jet engines. And again, I'm not spilling any secrets. This is all published information, obviously. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this discussion here. Is sometimes companies are surprisingly naive about the nature of their customers, right? So I mean, a lot of these manufacturers, the ones I deal with, again, I should say this might be different in the field of microelectronics, which I think is much more of a mass business. But people who make jet engines of this type, for example, they tend to be, the production runs tend to be relatively small, right? Precisely because you deal with things like the hobbyist market, or you deal with the market for engines for target drones or something like that, right? I mean, those are not manufacturers who easily manufacture thousands of pieces per year, right? So very often we're talking about production runs of in the hundreds, and the companies themselves tend to be very small. So if you're a company like that and you suddenly get an order for 100 engines from a previously unknown customer, I think what would make a lot of business sense would be to just apply the know your customer principle, which I think you should do anyway if you're, but it seems that in some cases the manufacturer at that moment, not suspecting any sort of evil intent, but are so excited about the sudden order volume that all caution goes out of the window and they say, okay, yes, of course, dear new customer, here are my 200 engines, please transfer the money to my bank account. And precisely because they're unregulated items, that's where it stops, right? So there's no need to actually get government approval. Very often in the case of the Dutch engine maker, the Dutch authorities under a catch-all provision actually did ask for an end-user certificate. For those of you who deal with arms transfers, an end-user certificate is basically an assurance by the recipient of the weapons or the technology that will stay with you and that you will not sell it on or transfer it on. It is, however, just a piece of paper. In the case of the engine maker, a Chinese company did provide an end-user certificate, but later investigations showed that the Chinese company in question had gone out of business prior to the export. So I think neither the manufacturer actually made a phone call to see whether the company was genuine, nor in that case the Dutch export control authorities. So they just accepted it at face value, and then because very often in these transfers you have, you know, the company who is the end user, who issues the end user certificate, who says, well, they're from us, right? But then you have some in-between companies who receive the shipment, who deal with its customs clearance and whatever. And basically that's where the diversion happens. So basically we were able to track the transit to the consignee, to companies in Hong Kong, but they never made it to the end user, or at least not the stated end user, because that company had gone out of business earlier on. And well, that's something which you can do, good business practice, right? So if you get suddenly a very large order from an unknown customer, be cautious. Even though the export might be legal, there might well be reputational damage in your future if you don't pay more attention. That seems to be an issue, particularly with sort of smaller enterprises.
I'll bundle the two questions. I think they very much can be compounded here. So in the sphere of limited capabilities, because we have so many export control regime sanctions, this new approach and this nexus between government and industries is really key, because it's the private sector that is the forefront of enforcement and in the crosshair of economic coercion. So how to make sure that these two collaborate or at least don't fight when it comes to really implement and enforcing rules, because economic statecraft, all of these rules then can be quickly futile or not as effective as they can be. And here I would say it's a twofold answer to this: carrot and sticks, right? So if we focus on sticks, much more natural response probably, it's the seriousness and I think credibility that penalties are coming. So in the US context, that has been really the key, that companies are seeking contact with OFAC, for example, and BIS, not vice versa, because they know that steep penalties are coming. But even within export controls, if we compare it with sanctions fines, penalties for export control violations are much, much smaller. So there is obviously reconsideration at BIS level how to increase the penalties, and this comes also with the appointment of the chief of corporate enforcement, who will be much more watchful of what's happening in this corporate field. In the US, the picture is much more different and complicated because implementation is the competence of member states, and due to different capacities, we had very uneven playing field. So one aspect that, again, the war in Ukraine has triggered the EU is to create this level playing field, especially when it comes to criminalization of sanctions. So leveling the penalties that can come with the violation, which is at least a good starting point to make sure that the same consequences will be happening in each member state. So this is on the stick side. On the carrot side, which I think is much more important, because ultimately you want front-end compliance rather than back-end compliance. Again, limited resources do not allow you to chase every company who willingly or unwillingly violates sanctions or export controls. So in a sense, you want to change the dynamic that companies are doing as much as possible, changing the sort of mindset when it comes to much more comprehensive, not ticking the box compliance, and really mapping out their supply chains. Not entirely possible, but more can be done to improve this visibility of supply chains. And here again, implementation and outreach from the government, signals that are coming from the government are really important, because companies would then hopefully listen more carefully what needs to be done. And a lot has already been achieved, again, as I mentioned, by BIS and new entity in the UK, OTC, that are geared towards providing needed guidance and advisory to companies, including small and middle enterprises, because they are so ill-equipped to do so. So we had tailored guidances in maritime sector, different, but there is more coming to manufacturers as well, because they were never faced with this problem to understand not just KYC, but KYCC, know your customers. The new sort of aspects of this carrot approach as well, which has already transferred from the US to the UK and increasingly to the EU, is voluntary self-disclosure. Again, that its companies are coming first to disclose if they have seen a violation either within their own company, or they've seen some violation or suspect some violation from their competitors. Quite questionable in some corners of this world, but this has been happening in the US much more successfully, that based on these voluntary self-disclosures, they actually led to quite a number of investigations. And here again, the cross-agency collaboration, BIS, DOJ, and others are really important, so that all agencies are working on the same sort of level was also important. And I think I'll finish with this one. So to encourage voluntary self-disclosure, the important case was to actually discard penalties if companies came forward, to really show that there is a goodwill when it comes to violations. Not always punished, but it's also can provide some good benefits for the companies to really retweak their compliance and not just being fined, because it's not always unwilling, as Wolf Christian indicated. Thank you.
Perhaps on the question, what is to be done? I think one really interesting question is what countries like Germany can learn from the strategies of these disruptive actors, especially when we're talking about these new disruptive technologies like UAVs. I think that's quite interesting. When you look at some of the new products that some private American companies are producing in terms of one-way attack UAVs, which look a lot like Iranian designs, and perhaps even too much like Iranian designs to be coincidental. So perhaps the flow of technology is now even moving in the US direction, with the US taking inspiration from certain very cheap Iranian designs. The question is, what can we learn from, for example, what's happening in the Middle East? Can we learn from what is happening in Ukraine in the field of disruptive technologies, especially drones? And I think this is a question that needs a lot of discussion because it is so complicated. Now in German discourse, you often see these calls for huge drone armies. We need to buy hundreds of thousands of FPVs. But of course, everyone looking at the development ecosystem within Ukraine will tell you that if you get a stockpile like that, it will be obsolete within perhaps a few years, perhaps a few months. So that is clearly not an option. You need to build some sort of ecosystem that is capable of both mass production in the time of need and of rapidly innovating. How do you do that when you don't have huge requirements because you don't have a war going on? So that is quite complicated. And then, of course, these disruptive actors have introduced interesting new strategic tools, like one-way attack UAVs with substantial ranges. I mean, Wolf Christian mentioned the Shahid with a range of 2,000 kilometers. That's basically a capability no one really had except Iran 10 years ago, because no one really thought about it. So how could we use this in our own defense strategy? Because it is different. We have a different way of fighting war. When you look, for example, at Ukraine, they have become very, very good at using one-way attack UAVs with substantial ranges for deep strike campaigns into Russia proper. But then again, they're doing that because they don't have air superiority. They can do the thing with their own aircraft. Could the West do that in the case of war, in the case of NATO alliance stepping in? Maybe you could use drones not to compensate for a lack of air superiority, but actually to achieve it in the first place. But how would that look like? How would the force mix look like? So I think all of these are interesting questions. What can we learn from them while basically starting from a very different baseline?
Thank you all very much. Fabian, I actually had a question for you. I was really struck by your comments about how Iran initially limited the kinds of technology it would transfer to the Houthis, but then those limitations dropped away. Kind of two questions about that. One, why do you think they did that? Is this an ideological thing? Was it desperation as its other proxies were under pressure? And then also, what does it tell us about the Iranians when it comes to the nuclear file? What can we learn about them? And let me turn to the audience in search of questions. But if yes, please.
Academic Association for Security Studies, I would come back to once again, I would come back to the issue of technology transfer between Russia and DPRK. I was wondering to what extent China could be to some extent a partner on export control and thus impeding technology transfer from Russia, or at least technology development by DPRK, for example, concerning satellite technology through this new strategic agreement they did, I think, in last year. Thank you.
I'll turn it back to the panel. Is there anyone jumping up with an immediate answer, top of mind? Go ahead.
So with the crumbling Iranian deniability, it's actually quite interesting because in the beginning, the deniability was quite good in a way. So basically, they delivered Scud missiles that looked just like the Yemenis might have been able to modify them themselves in the beginning. But then, of course, you had more advanced systems, and these came crashing down in Saudi Arabia. And then you had experts like Wolf Christian actually looking at the debris and realizing, oh, wait a second, there's a manufacturing logo of a company based in Tehran on one of these components. So it's probably not from the Yemeni army stocks. Then they had a separate strategy of deniability, and that was deniable systems. So now the Shahid is one of the most well-known UAVs in the world, but that wasn't always the case. So there was a time when it was this mysterious UAV that had popped up in Yemen. No one knew what it really was. The Iranians had never showed it before. That also changed. So why did they give up deniability? I think first because it's just difficult to hide. When you have a system full of subcomponents and you have investigators working for the UN documenting these kinds of things, you cannot keep stuff to secret. The second issue is that the Iranians just love talking about their military capabilities and love showing them. And basically, if you have compartmentalized activities, some of them very, very public, and some of them completely secretive, it's difficult to keep up. So when you look at, for example, the Saudis or the Egyptians, they basically do not talk about their missile capabilities, nothing. So it's difficult for stuff to leak out. With the Iranians, sometimes they make an accident and suddenly there's like imagery of a maneuver or an exercise and these deniable systems pop up. That happened with the Shahid, for example. That is one of the reasons I think they gave up. The other, of course, is that the Houthis now have a ceasefire with Saudi Arabia. Now you can frame all of the support to the Houthis as being exclusively directed against the US and against Israel, and you can be more open about it. While with the Saudis, you might still be a little more reluctant to show that you're supporting people firing missiles at their capital. What does it tell us about the nuclear file? I think you actually can see some similarities in the way that you just have a media environment that is a little bit too open to really keep up pretenses. Like if you think about some of the Iranian statements now that basically admit to the nuclear hedging strategy and say, you know, we don't have a car, but we have the tires, we have the steering wheel, we have the engine, we could assemble it in the end. I think all of these things finally leak out. So with the Iranians, to what extent can they really keep stuff secret, both thinking about how they're apparently quite infiltrated by Western or Israeli intelligence services and by how undisciplined some of their communications are, it's probably quite difficult.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, but I do see one more answer from Wolf Christian.
I'm not sure it's an answer, but the question on China. China is really interesting for any number of reasons. And I mean, again, I think both Maria and I and Fabian have spoken about what a complex role China plays, right? So China is both the origin of a lot of technology, but it's also a very important transit point for other actors. I mean, Iran has very clearly made China the center of its procurement network in recent years, and you can really see the shift. So in about 10 years ago, Iran would procure directly, right? More often than not, both actually in North America, but also in Europe. And if you were going along the sort of chain of custody of items, you know, it would go whatever from Frankfurt to Istanbul, from Istanbul to Tehran, or, you know, via Greece or, you know, other southern European nations very often. And then suddenly there was the switch, right? And then suddenly the same technology would first go to Hong Kong, as Maria says, or Guangzhou, or, you know, other major manufacturing hubs. And that's then where the trail would grow cold. And the reason for that is that China does not really cooperate with international tracing efforts, including those of the United Nations. Now, you could argue if this was a violation of European or North American sanctions regime, they could say, as they do, that these sanctions regimes are not binding to them, and that, as you know, it has long been the position of both China and Russia that the only, you know, international body who has the authority to impose sanctions is the UN Security Council. So, I mean, they could argue with some validity that they don't necessarily need to collaborate with, let's say, a German tracing request, but they also do not collaborate with a UN tracing request. That is certainly my own experience. I must have sent, I don't know, 40, 50 letters over the years to Beijing when I was still with the UN panel. The UN panels investigate sanctions violations, right? And China was certainly among the most hard-nosed partners, quote unquote, we had in this. So whereas, for example, the government in Tehran would endeavor to answer each and every letter, not that the response was necessarily terribly helpful, but, you know, at least they would acknowledge that there was a case. Beijing had a tendency to sit them out or to respond with one-line emails. So, you know, they do not really collaborate even with investigations by bodies they themselves are mandated in the Security Council. And if you look at the case of the DPRK panel, which is arguably the most important one, and where a lot of people thought that here China's national interests were at stake, because, I mean, much as the government in Pyongyang is an ally of China, there is the belief that China also doesn't want them to be getting too strong, right? So that there was a shared strategic interest. From what I'm hearing from people working on that sanctions regime, their experience with Chinese cooperation was also distinctly mixed. Let's put it this way. So that's why I'm saying China is interesting, because, I mean, unlike Russia, they seem to be playing along with some international efforts, but when it then comes to putting the money where your mouth is, Chinese collaboration isn't very much assured.
So, unless there are any additional questions, I am happy to give 5 minutes of sunshine back to you all in this lovely afternoon. I really appreciate the time you took to join us in this discussion. I know I had a good time. I know I learned a lot of things. I hope that applies to some of you as well. And I hope you'll join me in thanking our terrific panel.